Up next, Gordon Lang and I dive deep into the brand new and exciting Sony a7R Mark II on All About the Gear. Hi, it's Doug Kay here with another episode of All About the Gear with my roaming friend, Mr. Gordon Lang, who is in an undisclosed location. Hi, Gordon.
Hello, Doug. How are you? Only a few hundred miles north of you, I think.
That's right. It's amazing. You've come all this way and we're still only connecting through a Google Hangout. Why are you in Portland?
I'm in Portland to test the Sony a7R Mark II, which is what we're going to be talking about on this show. And also to drink the beer and the coffee, which is, as you know, is unparalleled in this city. It's very, very good. And it's such a beautiful location as well. I've visited Portland before and just the state is lovely and the city is lovely. I'm really digging it here. I like it a lot.
Good city for photography too, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a ton of street opportunities. I mean, it's kind of like San Francisco in many ways, I think.
Yeah, they have that nice, in sort of a tourist area, but there's the light rail system that takes you around downtown Portland that makes it really easy to get around.
And all the bridges, and you got Powell's bookstore, which is just astounding every time you go into that place. It's fantastic.
It is. It is. Okay, so this is a camera that even though this is only early August, some people are already talking about camera of the year for this guy. The a7R Mark II. And I'll give a little bit of background on this. The original A7 is what, coming up on 2 years or 3 years at the end of this year? How old is it?
More like about two and a bit years.
Yeah. And so this is a full frame camera that they did a high-res version, which was the A7R. I owned that camera. I also owned an A7, and I still own an A7S. But this is the high-res version. It had a lot of peculiarities, and now they have the Mark II. So tell us what they've done here.
They've done everything. This is not so much, even though it's Mark II, which would suggest a second-generation product, I'd go as far as to say it's a 2.5 generation product because it takes a lot of the improvements that they made with the A7 Mark II. And then they've gone even further than that, even though the A7 Mark II isn't that old either. So they've thrown absolutely everything into this camera. If you're familiar with the A7 Mark II, it looks very, very similar. They share essentially the same body. And crucially, they also share the built-in stabilization. So this is Sony actually shifting the sensor to counteract the wobbles. So this works with any lens you attach, whether it's a native lens or an adapted lens like a Canon or a Leica or whatever you want to put on this. The sensor itself has gone up in resolution. So previously it was 36 megapixels. Now it's 42. More importantly, on a kind of handling and usability viewpoint, it now features embedded phase detect AF points, which allow it to more confidently focus, especially in terms of continuous autofocus when things are moving towards you, not just for stills, but for movies as well. That for me, and we can talk about that more later, is a very important upgrade on this camera as a whole. It also shoots 4K video. And you don't have to sacrifice 4K or stabilization. You can have 4K and stabilization running at the same time, which is something that a lot of people wondered whether that would work or not. It shoots at 5 frames per second. The files are massively detailed. It doesn't have an optical low-pass filter, so they're very crisp. A lot of people worry about moire when you get rid of the optical low-pass filter, but I have been deliberately photographing fine grills on buildings, textiles, which would normally set the moire off, those kind of color shimmering patterns. So far, I haven't seen it. So I'm so far extremely impressed with this camera.
Yeah, so this is, most cameras that come out, all the companies have multiple models. They have one that specializes in this and specializes in that. And as they evolve these things, they tend to be, this one's a little better for that, and this one's a little better for this. And I think people were surprised that Sony put almost all of their goodies into one camera here, didn't they? I mean, like you say, 4K video, and it shoots to the card. You don't need an external recorder like you did.
Exactly. You needed the external recorder with the A7S, whereas this will record it internally like the Panasonic GH4 does. I mean, if you look back previously, they split the A7 line into three categories. There was the A7S, which was 12 megapixel, designed for high sensitivity and did 4K video if you had an external recorder. At the other end, you had the A7R, which was the high resolution, but maybe a little bit slow. And in the middle, you had the kind of general purpose A7 which originally did have some better autofocusing capabilities as well. But now they kind of put it all in one body. So this body has the high resolution, which of course they boosted. It has the superior autofocusing because it has the embedded phase detect, and it's a brand new system. It's 399 points with quite a broad spread. And I tested this with some long lenses. Again, we'll talk about that more later, but it will autofocus continuously well. So you have the action aspect of it, and you also have the high sensitivity aspect of it. They've actually, the maximum sensitivity, for better or worse, is 102,000 ISO. So it's not like what Canon have done, say, with the 5DS and 5DSR, where they said you can't go further than 12,800. And for good reason. When you look at those images at 12,800, they're not looking great. And similarly, the images are not looking fantastic when you bump this up to the highest ISOs as well. But at least they're there if you want them. You know, you can shoot at 102,000 ISO if you want to. So they've combined so much tech. And of course, the 4K video internally and the stabilization built in. There's very little, when you're looking at specs, there's very little that this camera won't do. I mean, if I was to be picky, I really wish they would put a touch screen on it. I love touch screens. I think Sony's idea is that touchscreens may not be appropriate on a pro level high-end body, but I think they're appropriate on everybody, on every camera body. I'm touch sensitive. You see, I have a body and it's touch sensitive. So why can't this be? Exactly. Well, you know, it's not like tablets and smartphones are not going to catch on. You know, we're already living in a touch sensitive, you know, a touch UI world. So I think the camera should have it, if only to just reposition the AF area. Yeah. Very useful to be able to do that. So it doesn't have that. And that's about it. We'll talk more about the controls and ergonomics when you're ready, because that's another thing that there could be some improvements made. But in terms of actual core specification, you know, there's little you could ask for, little extra you could do. And it also has a massive viewfinder. You know, they've managed to produce the world's largest electronic viewfinder image. And it's huge and it's detailed and it's no LED, so there's no kind of shimmering issues. This, you know, this camera does an awful lot.
We should probably do an unusual kind of review here and say, okay, let's just start with the perfect camera and work our way backwards and say, what isn't perfect about it? Now, a couple of things I noticed from what you've said already. One is 5 frames a second is not great for, let's say, people who shoot certain kinds of sports or wildlife or something like that. It's not the highest frame rate camera, but I guess that's probably because it's 42 megapixels, right?
Yeah, now that's a really interesting point because it does offer an APS-C crop mode, and this applies to stills and for video, whether you're shooting 1080 or 4K video. What you can do in any of those modes is shoot with the full frame, so you get the full coverage of the lens, and it scales it down to that video. Or you can shoot with a crop frame APS-C, which is also the Super 35 format if we're talking about movies. And it scales it differently. Now, I've not analyzed my video quality samples yet, but by the time you watch this video, I will have. So check out my detailed review of this at cameralabs.com, and you can download those samples. I've recorded the same scenes with and without the crop, and the scaling is different. You may prefer one to the other. But in terms of still photography, it does open up this question. If you're shooting in the APS-C mode, so you kind of crop the image, it's capturing less megapixels. Surely then, we've seen this on some other cameras before, surely then, is it not possible to shoot at a faster rate? Now, there's actually 2 technical things that prevent this from happening, or that you need to resolve to make this happen. One is being able to read the data off the sensor fast enough. I don't believe that's an issue, because Sony are very good at this, and if they can't do it now, they can certainly do it in the future. The other issue, though, is a mechanical issue, and that is being able to open and close a shutter at a faster speed, and that becomes a bigger challenge for full-frame cameras, especially if you want it to be damped nicely at the end. And that's one of the other improvements they've made with this over the A7R. The original is that the damping is better. It has an electronic first curtain. So when you take a picture, it's silent to start with, and then you hear the jick as it closes the shutter. But doing a full frame shutter, opening and closing, without shaking the body apart at very high speeds is very difficult. So that's one of the challenges that maybe they'll overcome for a future model. But as you know, as well, we're both fans of the A6000, and I just recently shot the 2015 Tour de France with the A6000 and the 70-200 f4. And again, it performed very, very well. Now, that's shooting at 11 frames per second. It has fewer phase detect AF points. And the interesting thing is that when you shoot with this camera in the APS-C crop mode, that spread of AF points goes almost to the edge of the frame. It's actually wider coverage than the A6000 with more AF points as well. So in terms of the actual autofocus point density and coverage, this is superior to the A6000 when you shoot in APS-C, but it shoots at half the speed. And that means that the gap between those frames is bigger. The action has moved further, and it's actually harder for the camera to refocus when those gaps are bigger. It's actually easier when it's shooting at 10 frames per second. But even then, I was shooting with this camera this week with the 70-200. I was shooting cyclists again, and it was delivering a very high hit rate. So yeah, it's only 5 frames per second. It's not a traditional high-end sports camera, but you can get some good results with it.
Now, I owned an A7R, the predecessor, if you will, to this camera. It was finicky. The shutter caused a lot of vibration, so you had to be very careful about locking it down solidly, and you had to pick your shutter speeds carefully, because if you were in a particular range, you'd actually get quite a bit of vibration, which you could see as blurriness in your images if you looked at them one-to-one. It wasn't, that camera was not at all a camera for a wide variety of applications like this one is. So they've really, like you said, they've combined things. How is the shutter, the mechanical shutter? Have they solved that problem?
Yeah, they've done a couple of things. What they've done is they've improved the damping mechanism. So when that shutter does open and close, it does it, or rather when it closes, it does it a lot more smoothly with less vibrations. But more importantly, it has that electronic first curtain. That is something that the DSLRs are missing, especially if you're shooting through the optical viewfinder. And this is something which, as resolutions increase, is becoming more and more of an issue. And it's interesting that when you're looking at a high resolution body, a fully electronic shutter is in fact ultimately preferable, because there's no mechanical vibration at all. Now, of course, as you know, there are issues with electronic shutters. This does have an electronic shutter option of 100%, which allows it to shoot in complete silence. Another benefit you don't get with the DSLR. But there are still some skewing artifacts. If you're panning across fast action or wobbling the camera a lot, you may see the image, you'll see some imperfections on the image. This is something they're working on, and I believe it's something that they've resolved on the RX10 Mark II and the RX100 Mark IV. It's not quite made it onto the full frame sensor yet. It's very difficult to do that. But I think in a few generations, a product like this could actually become fully electronic without compromise. And at that point, you will have no vibration issues. You will have probably better battery life, possibly. And you will also have the benefit of being able to shoot at extremely high frame rates, limited only by the speed at which you can pull that data off the sensor. And they're already on the RX10 Mark II and the RX100 Mark IV embedding DRAM into the sensor, which is allowing it to buffer better and being able to capture at extremely high speeds. And as I say, also resolve those skewing artifact issues. But already compared to the A7R, the shutter is so much better. I remember when I first tested the A7R, you'd take a picture and literally the shutter was so loud, birds would take off. People would turn around and look at it. What was that noise? It was not a discrete camera, and you'd go like this when you took it. That doesn't happen with this. In fact, I'll let you hear what the shutter sounds like. Can you hear that?
Yeah, not bad.
That's all right. That's pretty quiet. You don't really feel a lot of motion or vibration as it shoots. And as I say, there is a fully electronic option. And if you're shooting stuff that isn't moving quickly, or where you're not panning, that electronic shutter is really, really handy, because there's none of this. Well, there's no shutter noise. You could be at a wedding, a ceremony, or shooting discrete street type photography, and no one's going to hear you. And again, if you're shooting with the articulated screen angled up, you can shoot from the hip silently, and you have a very, very discreet camera. I mean, if we're being fussy here, Doug, and I am a fussy kind of guy, I wish this was a fully articulated screen, not just tilting vertically, because I shoot a lot in the portrait orientation. And in that scenario, a screen that only angles vertically is of no use to you when you're shooting at high or low angles. It is, however, useful when you're shooting around corners. And in some scenarios, like when I was shooting the Tour de France, what you can do, you have to be very careful, because we've all seen videos of people who've managed to knock these riders off. I'm not that guy. I'm never going to put them or my camera in danger. But you can angle it out like that, hold it in the portrait orientation, and just kind of angle it out a little bit. And then have, you can get in front of people really nicely that way. But I wish it was side hinged and fully articulated and touch sensitive.
Oh, they'll get there eventually. A lot of people who watch and listen to this show have yet to make the jump from the DSLR into the mirrorless market, and some for good reason. We talk about how great these smaller, lighter cameras are. The image quality is great, but sometimes, the bodies aren't yet as weatherproof as some of the high-end DSLRs and so forth. And if you're in the world of Sony, you're used to A7R, A7S, Mark II, and so forth. But if you're coming from, let's say, Nikon or Canon, the terminology is probably a bit of a mess for you. But one of the things I've heard about this camera that fascinates me is that you can take some of this DSLR legacy glass, Canon lenses, maybe even Nikon lenses, and you can not only use them with this camera, but apparently you can use them in autofocus mode, and it works pretty well. Did you get a chance to test that?
I did. I tried a variety of Canon lenses on the a7RmkII, using mostly the Metabones Smart Adapter version 4, and you do need to update that with the latest firmware, and that could change quite frequently. Now, the experience is extremely variable. It doesn't work with all lenses, the autofocus. When it does work, some of it is surprisingly fast and effective. Sometimes it's quite slow, but when you're comparing it to, say, a Canon DSLR in live view, it's pretty good. In some cases, if you get the right lens, you can enjoy an autofocus experience in live view with the Sony that is almost at the same speed as the Canon is through the optical viewfinder, as in you will lock on in less than half a second. The big difference is you could do this with the A7R, but it was a contrast-based system, and it would literally go and about 4 seconds later, after everyone had gone, your picture would be in focus. Fine if you're doing a landscape or an architecture shot, but certainly under no circumstances would you ever use that handheld. Now, the speed may vary on a lot of the lenses that you adapt to this, but the bottom line is that it is fast enough to use any of them handheld. It's that fast. So it does become very practical, but I would not sell this as a solution to use with Canon lenses alone. I see it as a stepping stone for people who are going from a Canon to a Sony system. Native lenses are going to give you a better overall experience, and it also depends on the adapter. I found some people complaining about the Metabones. I was shooting with other photographers, some saying that they were getting a better experience from the photodiox adapter. And really, this is where the internet comes into its own. Go onto forums, just search for Sony a7RmkII with adapter and lens, and you will almost certainly find some comments from someone who's tried that particular combination, and they'll say, yeah, it's great, or no, it didn't work, or sometimes it did, or you should adjust your expectations. Obviously, with some lenses that you adapt, you may lose autofocus. At the time that we made this video, I don't believe there was an operational one for Nikon lenses that offered autofocus, but I think that might be coming. That might be coming from somebody. But certainly for Canon EF lenses, you can adapt them, and the latest ones will autofocus, some faster than others.
Interesting. Okay, because we're jumping around here a bit, but that's okay. One of the cameras we've talked about recently was the new Canon 5DS and the 5DSR. These are Canon's 50 plus megapixel cameras. Oh, you happen to have one right there. How yes, convenient, huh?
Here's one I made earlier. This is the 5DSR, which is identical to a 5DS, except it has an additional filter which cancels the effect of the optical low-pass filter. So it's not like a D810 or a Sony a7RmkII, which has no optical low-pass filter. This camera counteracts, it cancels the effect of it in the same way that the original D800E did it. So who knows, maybe Canon in the future will do a new version of this, which just gets rid of that filter altogether. Because really, I'm not seeing wire on these cameras at all. Maybe I've been lucky, but from my experience so far, I would get the R version. But the important thing is, for people who are watching the video, I'm going to hold up these two cameras next to each other. So we've got the 5DSR on one side, and we've got the a7RmkII. They're both fitted with 50mm equivalent lenses. Well, not equivalent, they are 50mm. The Sony's the 55. I've got the Sigma R 51.4, which is a gorgeous lens on the Canon. And you can see that obviously there is a massive size difference between these cameras, but also a massive technological difference, because while they both deliver very high resolution files, and the Canon is a little bit ahead on numbers. It records 50 megapixels as opposed to 42, although in real life, it doesn't make that much difference. But let's look at what the Sony adds to that, which you don't get on the Canon. You get an articulated screen. You get an electronic viewfinder, which you may or may not prefer. You get built-in Wi-Fi with NFC, which I definitely like. You don't get that on the Canon. You get built-in stabilization. That, in my tests, is not as effective as the Olympus system by any means. I'm only getting 1 or 2 stops out of it, but that's still 1 or 2 stops. That's still useful to have, very useful to have. Some people may get better mileage out of that. The fact is, it is built in and it's there. You're also getting 4K video. You're getting 1080 video at 60p. The Canon only goes up to 30p. This will do 720p at 120 frames per second, so you can slow that down 4 times. It has, it just has so much.
What about the image quality?
Well, I've been comparing these two. The Canon, the 5DSR is a very, very crisp camera, and if image quality is all you care about, and a lot of people think that image quality is all they care about, but once you start using these things, you realize that there's other things you should be caring about too. Embedded face detect AF, for example, which this has, which allows it to focus better in live view and movies, which the Canon doesn't have. It's just contrast based. Image quality is quite similar. So far, as at the point that we made this video, I've not gone into as much detail as I would like, but by the time you watch it, I will have. So again, cameralabs.com, you will see a comparison between these 2 cameras. Initially, at the moment, anecdotally, the Canon is looking slightly crisper, but really there's not a great deal in it. And for me, just having stuff like that embedded face detect system, having the articulated screen, which the Canon doesn't have, having built-in Wi-Fi, having 4K video, having the ability to record lower resolution video at higher frame rates, these are all massive benefits, just even ignoring the size and weight aspect, which to me, as someone who travels a lot, is also important.
And what about the high ISO performance? Would the Sony excel there?
Again, I'll have to refer you to my analysis at Camera Labs, because I've not done it at the point we recorded this video, but I will have done it by the time you watch it. There is one other very important thing, though, and that is ergonomics and handling. Now, Sony are extremely good at packing these cameras with technology, but when it comes to actually going out and shooting with them, they are quite different experiences. For me, so for example, this has a little thumb wheel at the back and a little one at the front. They'll be familiar to anyone who's used any other Sony cameras. To me, they are too small, and they do not give a very satisfying click as you turn them. So, if you've got the camera set up to do 3 clicks for 1 stop when you're changing the aperture or the shutter speed or the ISO, it's very easy on some cameras to spin it and know you go click, 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 and I know I've changed it by a stop. On this, I kind of think, oh, did I do it 4 times, 2 times? Have I done it enough? It's just not tactile. And that is something which Canon and Nikon and Olympus have nailed a long time ago, I feel, on their cameras. Their ergonomic and control experience, to me, is much better. I hate these little dials, and you cannot use the small body as an excuse for this, because the EM1 is an equally small body, and it's got massive chunky dials and big buttons as well, which are much easier to operate with gloves. Now, if they're going to appeal to professional photographers, some of those photographers are going to be working in cold environments. They're going to be wearing gloves, even if they're thin little gloves. The fact is that this camera is harder for me to control and adjust the settings than it is on a Canon, a Nikon, or an Olympus. So when you actually pick these up and use them, these are very important things. I'm going to pick up the Canon again. Now, anyone who's used a higher-end Canon body from like the 7D upwards will be very familiar with the large thumb wheel on the back. Now, that, to me, is an ergonomic masterpiece. It's huge. It turns in a very satisfying manner. Big, chunky clicks and a very big, satisfying button right in the middle to set it. And also, while this wheel on the front is a little bit small, I think it just turns and clicks really, really nicely. When you've made, say, 3 clicks worth of adjustment, whereas on the Sony, I always inevitably end up slipping a bit too much. Maybe this is something you would adjust to if it was your only camera and you were using it all the time. But for me, I think Sony could make some massive improvements in its controls, and it should look to Canon, Nikon, and Olympus in that regard, because I personally feel that those companies have nailed it.
So we talk about Well, you mentioned the scenario of somebody's going out and shooting maybe landscape work. They want to use the high resolution capability of the camera because they've got lots of trees. They're going to print very large. The weather's iffy. They're going to wear gloves. So it makes me think of two questions I have. You know, we both like the A6000, but it doesn't have the feeling of a solid, rugged professional camera. It's a lightweight. I wouldn't call it flimsy, but it's hard to take it seriously until you look at the pictures, right? But the question is, comparing this to the bigger Nikons and Canons that all of us are used to, how does it feel in terms of ruggedness? And then what do you know about the weather sealing of this camera and its lenses compared to what you might get in the 5D level camera?
Well, the interesting thing about weather sealing, when you're a journalist or a photographer, you want a company to come out and say it's waterproof or it's splash proof or it's dust proof. You want an actual defined statement, but most companies are quite reluctant to come out with statements like that. And instead you have to rely on anecdotal evidence, really. Listen to what other photographers are saying or reviewers are saying when they've used them in those situations. Now, I have used this camera in some light rain and where water is being splashed towards it and with no ill effect. I would also, if you are an adventurous type of photographer, I'd encourage you to follow Brian Matiash and Colby Brown on their Facebook or Google. They're both Sony artisans, so they'll obviously be quite pro Sony, but they are shooting with these cameras in places like Lofoten or Iceland, you know, in cold places where it is going to be more demanding. And I spoke to Brian quite a lot because he's based in Portland. And he was saying that, you know, he's used it in very cold conditions without any issues and, you know, in some demanding environments. So it's really, I think it's a case of looking at how other people use it and have they succeeded or not, and hear from them. So the kind of people that Sony are going for here, it's not your 1DX or your D4 owners, because they've got extremely tough bodies that are very fast and sealed to a much higher degree. You know, they're not going after that. They're going after the 5D owners, the D810 owners. And in those respects, this camera is very competitively priced. Now, it may be Sony's most expensive. If you ignore Leica bodies, it's one of the most expensive mirrorless cameras to date. But again, very competitively priced for its specification. We were discussing it earlier, and I believe the body price at launch, you know, these of course become discounted over time, but at launch is $3,200, which sounds like quite a lot. But when you compare it to, say, Canon 5DS, how much is that one, Doug?
That's about $3,700. So, you know, $500 more for the Canon.
And another $200 extra if you want the 5DS-R with its additional optical low pass cancelling filter. So that's quite a big difference already, bearing in mind that the only advantage that the Canon has, the only advantages are arguably superior ergonomics, an optical viewfinder, if you think that's an advantage, and I do not. I prefer electronic composition, but there's pros and cons to both, and a fractionally high resolution sensor. And in the other camp, you've got the Sony, which is significantly cheaper and also has those benefits like better face detect AF for movies, an articulated screen, Wi-Fi, built-in stabilization, 4K video, blah, blah, blah. This camera's got a great deal. So it looks pretty competitive compared to that. Those are new cameras, though. If you're willing to go back a bit, there are other alternatives. The Nikon, or as you call it, the Nikon D810. What's the going rate for one of those?
D810 is now just under $3,000.
Okay, so still actually not that much difference, and that's 36 megapixels. Produces beautiful files, but again, like the Canon, is technologically quite old-fashioned. This may not bother you. I'm going to repeat those key differences: 4K video, articulated screen, built-in Wi-Fi, built-in stabilization. I know some photographers, traditional DSLR photographers, will go, well, that's fine by me because I never use any of that stuff. And to them, I say, well, I think you're missing out, but that's fine. If you know what you want and you truly understand that you are not going to get a benefit from those in real life, then fine. You know, you've got these other options to consider. But, you know, I think the DSLRs are looking quite old-fashioned. If you also have a look at the earlier version, the a7RmkII, heavily discounted now. What are you looking at for that?
That's $1,900, so that's quite a bit less expensive.
And that's great. Now, that camera had its issues. It's a version 1 product. But that's still not a bad price for a 36 megapixel full frame camera.
That's right. Yeah, it takes that camera. I know I sold mine. I had one. That's a camera that you have to put some effort into to really take advantage of the 36 megapixels. And I had the same problem with the D800E from Nikon. You had to be somewhat careful with it in terms of shutter vibration and other things. But when I reviewed the D810 from Nikon, I felt that those problems were pretty much solved. So it seems like most of these high resolution cameras go through a first generation problem phase, and their second generations seem to really hit the mark.
Yeah, Canon made a ton of improvements on the 5DS and the 5DSR to really minimize vibration. You know, when you look at it on the surface, you think, well, crikey, all they've done is put a high resolution sensor in a 5D Mark III body. And from the outside, that would appear to be what they've done, but they've done a lot of other little improvements to make sure that you stand the best chance of enjoying that resolution in practice. A lot to do with minimizing vibrations, more sophisticated mirror lockup, all of that sort of stuff. But again, when you look at mirrorless, the ability to have that electronic first curtain or a 100% electronic shutter, that's even better. And it's kind of ironic in a way that the best way to get the full resolution from a 5DS or a 5DSR or a D810 is to put it on a tripod, put it in live view, magnify that image and focus it in live view, at which point you're not using the optical viewfinder. You're using it essentially as a mirrorless camera that has a great big mirror attached to it that's just permanently out of the way. And if you're shooting landscapes, you've got to really ask yourself, if you're shooting in that way, would you be better off with a native mirrorless camera that is going to offer that same accuracy of focus and confirmation? And lest we forget, one of the greatest benefits of the electronic viewfinder is being able to magnify the image and employ things like focus peaking to make sure you've got that focusing just right. You can't do that with an optical viewfinder. You have to do it on the screen. If it's sunny, you're stuffed. With this, you're not. So you've got to ask yourself, you know, if I'm going to shoot a DSLR like a mirrorless camera, why don't I just get a mirrorless camera instead? Because that native experience is going to be better. The focusing is going to be faster. You're going to have the benefit of that electronic first curtain, and in some scenarios like this, the option of a fully electronic shutter for silent shooting. I mean, Canon has got on the 5DS a silent shooting mode, and I think in one of our previous episodes I demonstrated that. And it's like, here's the normal one, ka-jerk. Here's the silent one, ka-jerk. That's not silent. I kind of like to imagine they're developing this in a really noisy office. Hey, did you hear that? I didn't hear it. I can't hear you saying that though. That's not silent. It's slightly quiet. They should call it S for slightly quieter. SQ, you know, SQ mode.
I want a little detail that I've noticed in reviewing some of these cameras that I think maybe people aren't aware of. And that is the manual focus, comparing the mirrorless cameras typically to the DSLRs in live view mode. Most, if not all of the DSLRs, if you put them to live view mode, let's say you're stopped down to F8, you're going to take your shot, you're in live view mode. What you're seeing in live view is the camera set to F8. And that means you don't have the critical focus that you're going to get if that lens is wide open. You know, when you're using a DSLR in optical viewfinder mode, even if you set it to F8, while you're focusing, you're actually wide open.
Yeah, unless you use the depth of field preview button, right?
Yeah, but what it means is you have more light for your viewfinder and you have a wider aperture for focusing, so you can actually focus more accurately. Like I say, unless you push the preview button. But in live view, you're already more or less in preview mode on those cameras. You're already stopped down. And what that means is that you don't get the critical focusing that you might want. The mirrorless cameras, by and large, that I use are smarter than that. And that is, even in live view mode, they will be wide open until you press the button halfway down. And once you press it halfway down, then they stop down. That's their equivalent of a preview mode, if you will. But it means that you've got more light for the electronic viewfinder, but you also have more critical focusing. Have you noticed that at all?
Yeah, and also one of the important things to say there is that you can also feed that phase detect AF system that's embedded on the sensor the benefit of a brighter lens. So if you put an f1.4 and f1 lens on there, that phase detect system that's embedded will exploit that. And that allows these cameras to focus under very, very low light levels that could present a challenge to a viewfinder-based AF system on a DSLR. And that's quite an interesting thing. Again, a lot of people don't really talk about. The way these AF systems work is fascinating, and you can delve into it literally as deep as you want to go. Ultimately, the most important thing is to go out and use the thing and see which you prefer. I mean, this camera has 399 AF points that are spread over a larger area than the diamond pattern on a typical DSLR. So on a DSLR, you need to make sure if you want to track action, it needs to be within that diamond. And in fact, you need an AF point to fall over it. The density of them is increasing, but 399, that's a lot. That's a high density and a very large coverage. Again, if you go for that APS-C crop, it's virtually the whole frame. Now, the counter argument is those aren't cross-type sensors or zigzag sensors or squirrely-whirly type sensors. They're the most basic type, but they're very high density. There's a lot of them. Which is better? It depends what you're shooting. And, a lot of people just want you to go, just tell me which is better, and it's not as clear cut as that. Give it a score. I'll get the one that scored 84% instead of 82. You can't score these things like that. They're different. They perform differently in different scenarios. What I can tell you again is that when I was shooting action with this camera, I had low expectations. I thought it's going to suck. But it was actually really good. It was similar to shooting an A6000 at 5 frames per second. So your hit rate, it was similar, but you'd have fewer frames per second, but it was still effective. It does actually remind me at this point, though, with another difference that you get with Canon and Nikon, is they've been doing different autofocus systems for a very long time, and they're very clever in the options that they give, especially when you look at the 5DS, the 5DSR, which inherit the AF system of the 5D Mark III and the 1DX. It sounds quite old, but it's very good. And it's got excellent zoning and expansion options. When you have a single AF area, that's very precise. That's not very suitable for action. It's difficult to keep that over the subject. So what you do is you go for an expansion, either like a cross expansion or a square around it, or zoning. I'm really into zone AF at the moment, where you have like a whole cluster. But you say, I want that cluster to be in the middle or towards one side of the frame or the top or the bottom left or right. Now, the Canon system lets you move that around quite a lot, whereas the Sony system is a bigger cluster, and it's basically in the middle or a bit to the side or a bit above and below. And there are some scenarios where I preferred a smaller cluster that I could move a little bit more accurately. And it's when you're using it like this for sports where, if I was to hand this camera or an A6000 to a pro sports photographer, indeed, at the Tour de France, I was shooting next to somebody who had a D4 on one of the stages. And of course, the conversation always starts, they start laughing at you with your puny camera. What were you thinking of? And then you compare after every cycle has gone by and you're chimping and you're going, oh, hey, actually, you did get that shot. And it's like, yeah, do you want to try it out? And they try it out and they go, gosh, it's so light and it's actually fast and it can do it. And then they try and configure the AF system. They go, actually, I want it zoned and I want it to, I can't do that. It's lacking that sophistication of those higher end DSLRs. So that's another area. And I spoke to the Sony engineers about this. It's another area. If they want to pursue that, there will be some DSLR action shooters who prefer to have that real precise control over where you're telling the camera to look. And it doesn't quite have that yet. It's good enough for me because I'm not a pro sports shooter. But for people who are really into sports and action, they may prefer more control. But still, I think they would still be impressed, considering this is probably most famously a high-resolution full-frame camera. I think they would be impressed at how well it does focus continuously for action.
Well, very good. I'm trying to avoid getting one because the kind of photography I do, I don't have any need for 42 megapixel images. I'm happy with my 12 megapixel A7S, but I'm very jealous of the in-body image stabilization. I'm hoping Sony come out with something like that. I'm also somewhat intrigued by the autofocus potential for non-Sony lenses, but I'm going to hold off and see what they do next. Let me ask you this. Here we are halfway through the year. Is this a candidate for your camera of the year? Yeah,
definitely. Definitely. It's just got so much and does so much and delivers on so much, which is the important thing. When a camera comes out and it's announced, we all analyze the specs because that's all we have. If you go to, say, a press preview, as I do, you frequently have pre-production cameras, which you can't test. It's just really to look at. So you don't really know how it's going to perform until you actually get a final production unit like this in your hands. And frequently what happens is it has a feature, but there's a caveat. It doesn't quite work in this situation, only in this very specific situation. And that may be all right, or it may not be all right. The thing I found out having shot with the a7R Mark II for a while is that it delivers surprisingly well across a lot of its features. The resolution is very good. The continuous AF is better than I expected. The Wi-Fi and NFC Sony nailed a long time ago, so that just works beautifully. Except I should say, the way they implement the downloadable apps, now this sounds really churlish to complain. You know, this camera is the Sony cameras are the only ones that offer downloadable apps, apart from maybe Samsung. The only ones where you can actually even connect the camera to the internet and download apps within it without connecting it to a computer. But some of them really should be built in, like, you know, you have to download the time-lapse app, which admittedly they have updated and it's better than it was before, but I don't want to download, it should be in there. The really weird one is the smart remote, which is the one that's already built in, already downloaded for you, which lets you remote control it with your smartphone. But if you do it out the box, and this is the same with all Sony cameras to date, it offers very basic functionality. It will only do, there's no exposure control. And Doug, you may remember a time when I visited you in San Francisco. I just reviewed the A6000 and I said, Doug, I can't believe that it only offers really rudimentary control. And the answer is you need to update the app within the camera. Now, it's neat that you can upgrade the app within the camera, but why don't they just, if that is available when the shipping, why don't they just update it to start with? I can imagine a lot of people buy Sony cameras. This is at every level, even the RX products. If you don't update the smart remote app, you're not going to get the most out of it. It will just offer automatic control. You won't be able to tap on your phone to adjust the AF area. If you connect your camera to the internet and download an update for it, suddenly you get full manual control and you can tap to refocus. So you do effectively get that touch screen, albeit using your phone. So things like that. And if you want to change the quality setting and you're using an app, you have to do it within the app, not the other menu. I don't want to have to set that twice. I want it to record at this setting. I don't want to have to do it within the app menu. Even playing back the time lapse, you can't just press play. You have to press play within the app, the time lapse app, and do it with it. And it's a bit convoluted. But again, you can download stuff and update stuff on it, you know, which is cool. So it seems a bit mean to complain. So yeah, it does an awful lot. I'm really, really impressed with this camera. Yeah, I wish it had a touch screen. I wish the screen was fully articulated, and I wish it had bigger control dials. And I wish it had the Olympus stabilization. But apart from that, it's pretty remarkable.
Very good. So you're about at the end of your stay here in the States. You're heading back to England. Are you going to continue your family vacation?
Yes, and it'll be interesting to see whether when this video goes live, whether I'll still be on vacation. Let me qualify this. It is not a vacation. I'm working still every day. Look, I'm talking to you. This is, it's enjoyable, but it's still work. I'm testing cameras. I'm still writing reviews for cameras. I wrote my review of the Canon EOS 5DS while I was traveling. So yeah, I'm going to interesting locations, but when it comes to the evening in the hotel room, I get the laptop out and I do a full day's work before I can go to sleep. So I would prefer, instead of calling it a vacation, it's an adventure, a tour, a travel. So yes, as soon as I leave America, I'll be continuing driving through Europe. And if you follow me on Facebook or Instagram or Google Plus or Twitter, I post lots of pictures from some of the places that I'm visiting, and hopefully grab some really nice sample images for you to download. And I'll be taking this camera on some of that journey, so you should see some nice European sample images as well as the ones that I've grabbed in Portland.
Oh, very good. We look forward to that, and also remind everybody, since I don't know exactly when this is going to go live, because we've got a couple of reviews in the hopper here. You should definitely go to cameralabs.com, because you will get, by the time this is live, most likely you'll have Gordon's complete review. And if not, just check back, go there again. Cameralabs.com, where Gordon has very, very detailed, dare I say, anal and compulsive reviews of everything you ever wanted to know about all of these cameras. And if you're interested in getting an a7R Mark II, use the buy now links. The little affiliate revenues help us pay for the show.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so do that. And we've got some good stuff coming up. Gordon, I'm sorry I didn't get up to Portland to see you, to have some beer, have some coffee, but hopefully we'll get together again sometime soon, face to face.
And we can update our smart remote apps together again.
I'm going to say one more thing before we go about that. Based on my recommendation, someone the other day got his brand new A6000 and loved it. And I just thought I would pick it up and check the firmware revision in the camera. And of course, it was the 100 firmware. And I checked the lens firmware, and the lens firmware was 100. I said, you really ought to update the firmware. This is something that we have with all of our mirrorless cameras, maybe even some of the non-mirrorless cameras. But so many of the improvements now come out after the fact, and there's no notification system, I don't think. You have to be aware of the fact that new firmware is out there. So please, everybody, go online, search for your camera, put in the word, your model number and firmware, and see if there's an update, because everybody from Sony to Panasonic, Olympus, Fuji, all these manufacturers have made substantial improvements to your camera that you're missing out on.
Yeah, the A6000, just in particular they recently added XAVCS movie encoding on that. But most importantly of all, update that smart remote app. All Sony users, if you do your smartphone remote control and you do not have full manual control over the exposure, update the app in the phone, but also in the camera. Very important.
Okay. Gordon, thanks for that word of advice. And for everything else, this is a great review. I'm getting my a7R Mark II loaner from Borrow Lenses in a few days, so I'll be putting it through its paces as well. Hopefully I won't like it as much, because I really don't want to buy one. I've just purchased a Leica Q, and I'm trying to sell things to pay for that. So thank you very much, and we will see you on the next episode of All About the Gear. Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks, Doug. See you later.
Okay. See you. Bye-bye.